Hi, welcome to today's math lesson on graphing proportional relationships and determining what the unit rate, the slope is from the graph. Our do now question reads, a worker uses 450 inches of steel wire to make 675 springs of that same size. At this rate, how many inches of steel wire are needed to make one spring? So we're going to start by making a woe chart, which is going to help us write our proportion. The W represents or stands for the words or the units in the problem. In this problem, it's going to be inches and springs. The O stands for the original numbers or the original rate or unit rate. So we have 450 inches to make 675 springs. And lastly, the E column represents the equivalent values. So we want to make an equivalent ratio or equivalent fraction to the original rate, which is in the O column. So we don't know the number of inches, so we're going to put X to represent that unknown number. And we know we want to find out how many inches to make one spring. So now that we have our woe chart, we can write our proportion. Everything in the O column is going to go on the left side of the proportion, and everything in the E column is going to go on the right side of the proportion. So we have 450 over 675 on the left side, and we have that equal to X over 1. Now that we have our proportion, we're going to solve it using the butterfly method or cross multiplication and division. So 450 times 1 is 450. 675 times x is 675x. And we want to get the x alone. We want to find the value of x. So we're going to have to move this 675 to the other side. To do that, we're going to have to do the opposite operation. So right now, we're multiplying 675 by x. So the opposite of multiplying is dividing. So we're going to divide 675 on both sides. (675) divided by 675 is 1, so we can cross it out and we're left with 1x, which we're just going to write x. Now we have 450 divided by 675, and that is 0.6666 with the 6 repeating. So we're going to simplify that by just writing the line on top of the 6 to show that that number is repeating. And now we can go through the answer choices and see which fraction has an equivalent value of 0.6 with the repeating 6. So with 2/3 inches, when we divide 2 divided by 3, we get that 0.6 repeating decimal. And so we know that our answer choice is going to be F. Today's TEK is 8.4b. Our lesson target is that scholars will graph proportional relationships, interpreting the unit rate as the slope of the line that models the relationship. Our DOL is given 4 problems. Scholars will graph proportional relationships with 100% accuracy. Some academic vocabulary words to review before we start our lesson is the words rate of change, unit rate, and slope are all referring to the same thing or the same idea, the same concept. And to find the unit rate, the rate of change, the slope, we're dividing our change of y by our change of x. And so in math, when you see this triangle in front of a variable, we're finding the change of, and it's the delta symbol. This journal problem reads, every 3 seconds, 4 cubic feet of water pass over a dam. So this is our 3-column process chart that we can use. The first thing that I'm going to do is figure out what the independent variable is in this sentence. So the independent variable doesn't rely on anything else. So time is usually that independent variable because time doesn't depend on anything. So in this case, our time is going to be represented in seconds, and so we're using x to represent that independent variable. So that means that cubic feet will be our unit for our dependent variable, which will be represented with y. So I'm going to start off by finding that slope, that unit rate, that rate of change by using the equation k is equal to y over x. And so I'm going to plug in the values of y and x. So in this case, the value of y is going to be 4. The value of x is going to be 3. So I can actually fill this out right here. Our rate of change, or our slope, is 4 over 3. And from here, I can write an equation because proportional relationships are always written in the form y is equal to k times x. So all I'm going to do is substitute or replace the k with the value of k. So in this case, our value of k is going to be 4/3 or 4 over 3. So our equation is y is equal to 4 over 3 times x. And we're going to write this equation in this middle column of the 3-column process chart. So we have 4 over 3 x, and then will be equal to our volume, or that y value. So I'm going to plug in some x values, or some times. So let's say 0, 3, 6, 9. So in the process column, all I'm going to do is multiply the 4/3 by those x values. So when x is 0, we're multiplying 4/3 times 0, which is going to make 0. When x is 3, we're multiplying 4/3 times 3, which makes 4. When x is 6, we're multiplying 4/3 times the 6, which makes 8. And lastly, when x is 9, we're multiplying 4/3 times 9, and that's going to make 12. So as you can see here, on the right side, the difference between 4 and 8 is positive 4. The difference between 8 and 12 is positive 4. So our change in y values is 4. And then our change in x values, the difference between 3 and 6 is positive 3. The difference between 6 and 9 is positive 3. So our change in x values is 3. And that's how we get our rate of change, or our slope, from the table. So for this first IG problem, we're given this graph right here, which is the lunch cost. And so we're given the total cost and the number of school lunches. So it reads, the graph is showing the relationship of the total cost versus the number of school lunches. What is the average cost of lunches in dollars? So what we're going to do is pick out some points here. So we have 0, 0, and then we have 8, 18 represented by those yellow dots. And we're going to fill out our 3-column chart process. So we have the 0, 0, and 8, 18. And now we have to figure out what our change in y is over our change in x to figure out the cost per lunch. So our change in y from 18 to 0 is 18. So that's going to go here. And then our change in x from 8 to 0, that was a difference of 8. So we have 18 over 8. And when we divide, we get 2.25. So that means that the cost per lunch is $2.25. And so now we can fill out this middle column in the process chart, the 3-column process chart. We have 225 times x. So if we multiply 225 times 0, we get 0. And then if we multiply 225 times 8, we get the 18. We have a we-do problem which looks very similar, and our next I-do problem has this graph right here. It says the graph is showing the relationship. Mary pays $150 for 9 carpets cleaned, and we have to determine if we can use the graph to model Mary's situation. So first we have to select 2 points. So we have 0, 0 selected, which is our origin, and then the other point we have is going to be 3, 50. So our first point is 0, 0, and then we have 3, 50. And we're going to figure out our change in y values. So from 50 to 0, that was a difference of 50. So we have 50 over, and then our change in x values from 3 to 0, that was a difference of 3. So our change in x was 3. So now we have 50 divided by 3, and that is about 16.67. We're rounding to 2 decimal places, or to the hundredths place, because this is in money amounts. And so we're going to fill in the middle column of our chart. So we have 16.67 times x. So when x is 0, we're doing 16.67 times 0, and that gives us the 0. And then when x is 3, we're doing 16.67 times 3, and that gives us 50. So now we're going to try to figure out if Mary's rate is equivalent to the rate from the graph. So we have 50 over 3, and we know that is equal to $16.67 per carpet. And then we have that Mary paid $150 for 9 carpets. And so over here, the 9 carpets would be here, and of course 150 would be off the graph. So we just have to divide 150 divided by 9, and we get 16.67, or about that if we rounded to 2 decimal places. And so yes, we can use this graph to model Mary's situation. In the next IG problem, we're given this graph right here, and so we have to identify points on the graph. So our first point is going to be the 0, 0. You can always use the origin as a point to determine your slope from. And this isn't a good point because it's not at an intersection, or it's not where the 2 lines of the graph or the grid meet. This is not a good point. 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 It looks close, like it's at the intersection, but it's a little to the left of these 2 lines right here. But this one right here is a good point, since it is at the intersection of the grid or the gray lines. And so this point right here is 1, 8. And to identify the unit rate or slope, we have to figure out what the change in y is. So our change in y is going to be 8. So we have 8 over our change in x, which is 1. So when we divide 8 divided by 1, we get 8. So again, we have to write a proportional equation in the form y is equal to k times x. So we have y is equal to 8 times x. We have a couple more we do problems and then you do problems. And to find the solutions to the we do's and the you do's, since I'm not going over it now, I'm going to post a PowerPoint in the description box. So if you want to double check your answers for these you do problems, as well as follow along in the Nearpod lesson, that will also be linked. And so lastly, you have a 4-question DOL, and it's a Google form. Thank you so much for following along and paying attention in today's lesson, and see you in the next math video.